Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann, and I am having some conflicting feelings about this book, In the Land of Men by Adrienne Miller, which I finished yesterday, and I'm very proud of myself because this was a Christmas present from my sister-in-law, and I finished it on January 26th, so we're going to go ahead and say that I finished it a month after I got it, which is unheard of. I pretty much never do that. And I feel bad about it, and I want to be better, and so I'm very proud that I did it with this book. But anyway, this book is really interesting. So it's a memoir by Adrienne Miller, who is writing about a time in the late 90s, early 2000s, when she was just out of college, and she was an editorial assistant at GQ magazine for a couple of years, and then she was hired as the literary fiction, or the literary editor specializing in fiction. Anyway, sort of a long title, but anyway, she was a fiction editor for the magazine Esquire for, I believe, 7 years, going from 1997 into the early 2000s. And so she published mostly short stories, acquired them, edited them. And this book is fascinating as a tale of how that literary fiction world and the magazine world worked at that time. And so folks who are interested in literary fiction, and maybe especially in short stories, I think would really appreciate that aspect of the book. I really loved it because I felt like I got a window onto a world that I pretty much never think about. So that was really, really interesting. And it's ostensibly billed as a memoir of that time in the publishing of fiction in magazines, short fiction. And it's also billed as, the story of a young woman who's making her way in a world that's dominated by men, in a profession that's dominated by men. And so a lot of that was really interesting. She responded to some situations and to things a little bit differently than I think I would, but also the late 90s, early 2000s is a very different time to be sort of coming of age professionally in a field dominated by men than when I've been doing it, which is over 20 years later. So that was interesting, and also just a nice snippet, I guess, of how that went for her. But then the confusing thing about this book is it's her memoir. It's a memoir. And it starts out in all the ways that I've just been talking. But then by the time you get to the end of it, I felt like I knew David Foster Wallace, the author of Infinite Jest, better than I knew the author of this memoir, because a lot of the book focuses on her relationship with him, both as his editor, because she edited some of his stories for Esquire, but also as his romantic partner, because they dated for a period of time in there as well. And then they were really close friends before and after they dated. And so I think part of that is just who she is as a person. Also, this is my cat, Pookie. Pookie apparently wants to be in the video. Um, she comes across as a very reserved, very private person. She talks about growing up in Ohio and makes a lot of references and jokes to sort of Midwestern culture throughout the book. And so part of that is a little bit consistent. It just seems like she's a reserved, private person. So we didn't get to know her as well, but it was just very jarring and disorienting to feel, even as I was reading it, and then especially when we got to the end. It's like I still couldn't really tell you who Adrienne Miller is, but I could reflect a lot on who David Foster Wallace was. So that was just odd, and it feels really weird to read a book that was supposed to be about feminism in the workplace and sort of overcoming patriarchal expectations and things like that, and then to come out of it feeling like the memoir of the woman is subsumed in I don't want to say like a biography of the man, but in just like sort of a state of David Foster Wallace's like emotional maturity in relationships. Like that came to dominate the book. And she did mention in the book that what she had actually started out writing was going to be about that relationship, and then it turned into something a little bit bigger. And to me it just feels like it didn't quite turn into something a little bit bigger. It's basically like she provided a little bit more backstory about sort of how they came to be, and a lot of sort of literary publishing industry interesting stuff. But it was still like the meat of the book. Like everything was in that part of it, which was a big part in terms of pages. So I feel really weird about that. And it makes me not sure I liked the book. I did like a lot of it. I thought the writing was good, but even there, she overused a few techniques. So there were many times throughout the book where she'd be describing something that had been happening, or she'd be describing some trends and movement in the literary fiction publishing industry. And then she'd sort of start a paragraph with just questions. And then she'd have a few questions that were sort of like meta level questions, like things that help you process what she'd just been talking about. But it was that technique, right? It was that conceit of doing questions and then those questions. A few times she mixed it up where she'd sort of give you the questions. And then at the end of that little snippet, she'd say, these were questions. And I like those techniques, but she just overused them in the book. They occurred way too many times. And that's the sort of thing where it stands out so much in the writing that I feel like, in a book of this length, it's what, 340 pages long. You can really only use that like 4 or 5 times, like both of those things combined, before it really starts to stand out for me as a reader anyway, of just being like, okay, I get it. You were having questions. Like, it did that technique just got a little bit old for me. So that was a little bit annoying too. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. So anyway, I'm curious, has anybody else read this? What do you think? Because right now, a day after finishing it, when I finished it last night, I was like, yeah, okay, that was good. I sort of put it down. I also had sort of a niggling feeling of like, maybe I want to read Infinite Jest again, because I read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which gets mentioned a lot in this book, in 2011, and thought it was all right. Thought it was, a little overdone. And this book sort of made me curious about maybe reading it again when I was thinking about it last night. And then I woke up this morning and I was just like, you know what? That book was really frustrating. So I'm landing with this book is frustrating at this point in time. So has anybody else read it? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening to me rant a little bit. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.